November 27, 1968. Thanksgiving Day, Firebase Sierra, Central Highlands, Vietnam. Specialist for Robert Sohn watched through the open door of the UH-1 Huey as traces carved red lines through the morning mist. His M60 machine gun hung from bungee cords, the barrel still warm from the previous insertion. 23 years old, barely 2 months in country, he had already learned what the training never taught him. In a helicopter flying at 1500 FT over hostile jungle, there is no cover, there is no concealment. There is only the open door, the wind, and the enemy below with weapons pointed upward. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Over 10% of all Vietnam War casualties were helicopter crew members. Of the 675 Americans who died in helicopter operations, 274 were aircrew. And among those aircrew, door gunners represented the highest casualty rate of any aviation position. They sat in open doorways, fully exposed, armed with 30 lb machine guns, tasked with suppressing enemy fire, while their aircraft hovered at the most vulnerable moment of flight, the landing. What none of them knew during those first insertions was that they were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting physics, tactics, and a fundamental truth about helicopter warfare that would take years to fully understand. The door gunner position was not designed to be survivable. It was designed to be effective, and effectiveness in the calculus of war often demands sacrifice. The journey to understanding why door gunners did not survive Vietnam begins not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the design requirements of the Bell UH-1 Iraq-K helicopter. When the United States Army first deployed the Huey to Vietnam in 1962, it arrived as a utility helicopter, unarmored, lightly armed, built for medical evacuation and troop transport in Bay, what military planners assumed would be a limited advisory role. The original HU-1 designation stood for helicopter utility. The crews quickly shortened it to Huey, and the nickname stuck. The early Hueys flew without dedicated door guns. Crews improvised with whatever weapons they could mount. M1 carbines, M14 rifles, M16 rifles held out the door by soldiers hoping to suppress ground fire. The concept of a dedicated door gunner arose from necessity, not planning. As helicopter insertions into contested landing zones became routine, crews discovered they needed suppressive fire during the most vulnerable phase of flight. Those final 30 seconds of descent when the helicopter slowed, steadied, and hovered 3F'd above the ground while troops jumped out. By 1963, the M67.62 62mm machine gun became standard equipment on both sides of the Huey. The M60 weighed 24 lb unloaded. Add the ammunition and a door gunner was managing over 200 lb of weapon system. The gun could fire up to 700 rounds per minute. In practice, gunners fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. The weapon was mounted on a pintle at first, a swiving post that gave limited range of motion. As the war progressed, crews switched to bungee cords suspended from the cabin ceiling. The cords supported the weight while allowing the gunner full freedom of movement. This evolution seemed like an improvement. More flexibility meant better coverage. Better coverage meant more effective suppressive fire, but it also meant something else. It meant the door gunner had to lean farther out of the aircraft to engage targets. It meant more exposure, more vulnerability. The very adaptation that made them more effective also made them easier to kill. Warrant Officer John Masaki arrived in Vietnam in 1968. Assigned to a UH-1C gunship unit, he completed door gunner school and crew chief school stateside, learning to maintain the helicopter and operate the M60. Nothing in that training prepared him for the reality. In a later interview, he described his first combat insertion. The noise made conversation impossible. The vibration from the rotor blades above, the engine roar, the wind screaming through the open cabin. Then the aircraft commander gave the signal, and they descended toward the landing zone. The door gunners on each side opened fire. Masaki squeezed the trigger and the M60 roared. Spent casings and belt links ejected into a canvas bag attached to the gun, preventing them from being sucked into the rotor system or falling on troops below. He aimed at the tree line, watching his traces, every fifth round glowing red arc toward the jungle, firing before you see the enemy, firing to keep the enemy suppressed, firing because the moment you stop firing is the moment they have time to aim. The sound of incoming fire was different from outgoing. Outgoing fire had rhythm, purpose. Incoming fire cracked past with random chaos. Masaki heard rounds snap past his head, saw the aluminum skin of the helicopter puncture. One round came up through the floor, missing him by inches. Later, he learned that round had lodged in the Bible of the soldier next to him. The helicopter completed the insertion and climbed out. Masaki checked himself, no wounds. But the mission was not over. They would fly 12 more insertions that day. The concept of the hot landing zone defined door gunner experience. A hot LZ meant the enemy was actively engaging the helicopters as they landed. Artillery would prep the zone first, pounding the area with high explosive shells. Then helicopter gunships would make rocket runs firing 70mm rockets and minigun bursts. Finally, the slicks, the troop-carrying Hueys, would come in. 8 to 10 helicopters in formation, carrying 60 to 80 soldiers total. The door gunners on the slicks would open fire as they descended, suppressing any remaining enemy positions. In theory, this preparation reduced risk. In practice, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong learned to wait. They dug fighting positions with overhead cover. They positioned troops in concealed locations with clear fields of fire toward the landing zone. They learned the helicopter approach patterns, and most critically, they learned to concentrate fire on the helicopters themselves rather than the troops they carried. A downed helicopter meant a crashed aircraft, probably wounded crew. Definitely a valuable prize to be captured or destroyed. It meant other helicopters would have to attempt rescue, creating more targets. Specialist for Thomas Pina flew as co-pilot on Chalk 2 during an insertion near the Cambodian border. The flight lead called the landing zone clear. No enemy contact. Chalk 1 landed successfully. Chalk 2 began its approach. Then the tree line erupted. AK-47 fired distinctively sharp cracks. RPG-7 rockets recognizable by their whoosh and trailing smoke. Heavy machine gun fire, probably a 12.7mm DHK. The weapon Americans called a .51 caliber. The door gunner on Penta's aircraft returned fire immediately. The crew chief on the other side did the same, but an RPG streaked toward them. It missed by feet, exploding in the trees beyond. Small arms fire tore through the thin aluminum skin. The Huey had minimal armor. The pilots sat in armored seats, but only because lessons learned from previous casualties demanded it. The door gunners had no such protection. They wore flak vests designed to stop shrapnel, not rifle rounds. Some wore ceramic body armor plates nicknamed chicken plates, 22 lbs of chest-shaped protection worn inside the flak jacket, but the plates only covered vital organs. Arms, legs, head all remained exposed. Penta's helicopter took multiple hits. He heard the distinctive sound of rounds punching through aluminum, felt the shudder as hydraulic lines were severed. The aircraft commander fought the controls as the Huey lost altitude. They crashed short of the landing zone. Penta survived with injuries. The door gunner did not. An AK-47 round had struck him in the head during the descent. He was 19 years old, 3 months in country. The exposure factor defined door gunner mortality. Consider the physics. A helicopter in the landing phase flies at 10 to 15 knots, roughly 12 to 17 mph. It descends at 300 to 500 ft per minute. At this speed and descent rate, the aircraft becomes a relatively stable target for ground fire. The door gunner standing in the open doorway or sitting on the edge of the deck presents a clear silhouette against the sky. He cannot take cover. He cannot maneuver. He can only fire and hope suppression keeps enemy heads down long enough to complete the insertion. The M60 itself created additional vulnerability. To engage targets effectively, the gunner had to expose himself, lean out, extend the weapon, track targets as the helicopter moved. This required constant movement, constant adjustment, and constant exposure. Veterans described it as being a target in a shooting gallery, except the targets shot back. The weapon malfunctions added to the danger. The M60 was notoriously prone to jamming in Vietnam's heat and humidity. The rotating bolt could fail. The extractor could break. The exposed barrel latch, a swinging lever, would catch on equipment and accidentally release, causing the barrel to fall out during flight. When a jam occurred, the gunner had to clear it immediately. This meant taking attention away from the enemy, taking hands off the weapon, working the problem while hostile fire continued. Warrant Officer Ron Timberlake commanded Chalk 6 during the same operation where Penta crashed. Timberlake heard the radio call that Chalk 2 was down. He heard the flight leader abort the remaining insertions, but Timberlake saw wounded Americans on the ground. He made a decision that would earn him the Silver Star. He brought Chalk 6 back into the landing zone. The approach was 90 degrees off the planned axis, directly facing the enemy battalions firing from the tree line. Timberlake's door gunners opened fire as they descended. Timberlake's door gunners opened fire as they descended. 60 machine guns hammering, trying to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously. RPG rounds whooed past the helicopter. Small arms fire punched through the aircraft. The gunners kept firing, kept exposing themselves, kept doing the job. Chalk 6 landed. 10 wounded Americans scrambled aboard. The North Vietnamese concentrated fire on the stationary helicopter. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Finally, fully loaded, Timberlake lifted off. Both door gunners had been hit. One wounded but functional. One killed during the ground time. The helicopter made it back to base trailing hydraulic fluid and smoking. The casualty mathematics became unavoidable by late 1963. Intelligence officers at every aviation unit tracked the numbers. Door gunners were being killed and wounded at rates that exceeded infantry machine gunners. This seemed counterintuitive. Machine gunners on the ground were high-priority targets. Enemy forces specifically targeted them because of the weapon's effectiveness. Yet Dr. Gunners supposedly protected by being in an aircraft were dying faster. The reason became clear through combat analysis. Ground-based machine gunners could use cover. They could take advantage of terrain. They could shift positions between engagements. They operated as part of a larger unit that provided mutual support and security. Door gunners had none of these advantages. They flew in predictable patterns toward known landing zones. They operated from platforms that could not stop, could not take cover, could not maneuver effectively at low altitude, and they were silhouetted against the sky, visible from hundreds of meters away. The Army began studying door gunner tactics in detail by mid-1964. Training was formalized, schools were established, but training could only do so much. The fundamental problem was not training, it was mission profile. Helicopters conducting combat assaults had to fly low, had to fly slow, had to hover in or near the landing zone. These requirements created vulnerability that no amount of training could eliminate. Captain Robert Shawley commanded a rifle company during operations in the Central Highlands. He worked closely with helicopter crews and understood their limitations. In a post-war interview, he described watching insertions from the ground. The helicopters would appear flying in formation. The door gunners would be clearly visible in the open doors, weapons extended. As the aircraft descended, you could see the gunners leaning out, firing, trying to cover every possible threat sector. Then the aircraft would touch down or hover, and the troops would jump. During those final seconds, the door gunners were the only thing standing between his men and concentrated enemy fire. They drew fire. They took fire. They died doing it. But they kept his soldiers alive long enough to get boots on the ground. The weapon load made survival even more difficult. Door gunners typically carried 1,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, sometimes more. The belts of ammunition hung from the cabin ceiling or were stored in cans secured to the floor. This ammunition was explosive. A tracer round or incendiary round striking the ammunition storage could detonate the entire supply. Several helicopters were lost this way. Enemy fire would penetrate the cabin, strike the ammunition, and the resulting explosion would destroy the aircraft. The door gunners were sitting next to this hazard throughout every mission. The evolution of enemy tactics made the situation progressively worse. The North Vietnamese Army learned from experience. Early in the war, they would engage helicopters with whatever weapons were available. Individual soldiers with AK-47s, small unit actions with light machine guns. But by 1965, they developed dedicated anti-aircraft tactics. They positioned heavy machine guns along known helicopter routes. They pre-positioned RPG-7 teams near potential landing zones. They trained soldiers to lead the target, aiming ahead of the helicopter to compensate for its movement. The 12.7-meter DSK heavy machine gun proved particularly deadly. This weapon, equivalent to the American .50 caliber Browning, could punch through helicopter aluminum like tissue paper. It had range, it had penetration, and it had rate of fire sufficient to track moving aircraft. The North Vietnamese would position these weapons on hills overlooking valleys where helicopters had to fly. The guns would fire in short bursts to avoid counterfire, but those bursts were devastatingly effective. A single burst could shred a helicopter's tail boom, sever control cables, or kill crew members. The RPG-7 added another dimension of lethality. Originally designed as an anti-tank weapon, the rocket-propelled grenade proved equally effective against helicopters. The cone-shaped warhead traveling at 300 mm could destroy a Huey with a single hit. The shaped charge would penetrate the thin skin and detonate inside, shredding the interior with shrapnel and overpressure. Door gunners had no defense against RPGs. They could see them coming, watch the smoke trail, but could not evade. The helicopter would either be hit or it would not. Luck, not skill, determined survival. By 1966, over 11,800 helicopters of all types had served in Vietnam. Approximately 5,000 were destroyed, almost all by hostile fire. These numbers meant that roughly 42% of all helicopters sent to Vietnam were shot down or damaged beyond repair. For crew members, this created a statistical certainty. Fly enough missions and you would be shot down. The only question was whether you survived the crash and subsequent combat. Door gunner Michael Hullman flew with the 281st Assault Helicopter Company. He described a typical mission profile. 15 Hueys would fly into the AA Valley, a known hotspot near the Laos-Oceanian border. They would fly out with 6 or 7. The others would be shot down or so badly damaged they had to divert to other bases for emergency repairs. He once flew on a helicopter whose engine quit mid-flight. The pilot managed an emergency landing in what Hullman described as the middle of nowhere. They waited for rescue, completely exposed, while friendly forces scrambled to reach them before the enemy did. The psychological impact of this constant danger created what medical personnel called combat stress reaction. Door gunners flew multiple missions daily, typically 4 to 6, sometimes more during major operations. Each mission meant 30 minutes to 2 hours of potential combat. Morning insertions, afternoon resupply, evening extractions. The cycle repeated daily for the 1-year tour of duty. There was no rear area for door gunners. Every flight could be their last. The close quarters of helicopter combat made casualties even more traumatic. In ground combat, soldiers often did not see the moment a comrade was hit. In helicopters, the crew was confined to a space roughly 10 ft by 6 ft. When a door gunner was hit, everyone saw it, heard it, felt it. The crew chief sitting across from the door gunner watched him die. The pilots heard the impact. The soldiers being transported witnessed the horror. There was nowhere to look away, no way to process it before the next mission began. Crew chiefs had an additional burden. They were responsible for maintaining the aircraft and serving as door gunners. This dual role meant they had intimate knowledge of every system on the helicopter. They knew where the hydraulic lines ran, where the fuel cells were located, which components were armored and which were not. This knowledge meant they understood exactly how vulnerable they were. They knew that an AK-47 round through the wrong location could bring down the aircraft. They knew the thin aluminum skin provided no protection. They knew they were one lucky shot away from death. The famous LZ-X-ray battle during the IA Drang campaign in November 1965 illustrated door gunner vulnerability on a massive scale. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, conducted combat assaults into a small clearing at the base of Chupong Mountain. Intelligence indicated North Vietnamese Army units in the area. The first wave landed successfully. Then the enemy attacked in force. 3 North Vietnamese regiments, roughly 3,000 soldiers, had been waiting in prepared positions. The helicopters continued flying insertions into the landing zone throughout the day, 16 Hueys per wave, making the 34-mile round trip to pick up more troops. Every insertion came under increasingly heavy fire. Door gunners watched North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the elephant grass, saw muzzle flashes from dozens of positions, returned fire while incoming rounds tore through their aircraft. Captain Ed Freeman flew 14 missions into LZ-X-ray that first day. Major Bruce Candle flew 22. Both flew unarmed Hueys, medical evacuation birds with red crosses painted on the nose. Geneva Convention rules prohibited arming medical aircraft. The door gunners carried only their personal sidearms. They watched helplessly as enemy fire shredded their helicopters. They could not return fire, could not suppress the enemy, could only sit in the open door and hope incoming rounds missed. Freeman described the experience decades later. They were eating helicopters alive. I took over 50 rounds in my helicopter. The attack was so intense that helicopter operations into the landing zone were shut down multiple times. Aircraft had to be swapped out due to battle damage. Door gunners were wounded or killed and replaced with volunteers from other crews. The suppressive fire from door gunners on armed helicopters was the only thing keeping the casualty evacuation going. Without them, the entire operation would have collapsed. The toll was horrific. By the end of the 4-day battle, 79 Americans had been killed at LZ-X-ray, 121 wounded. 9 Americans had been killed at LZ-X-ray, 121 wounded. Helicopter losses and damage were catastrophic. But the door gunners had done their job. They had kept firing, kept their aircraft operational long enough to insert reinforcements and extract wounded, paid for it with their lives and their blood. The armor problem persisted throughout the war despite attempts at solutions. Engineers developed various armor kits for Hueys, ceramic plates that could be bolted to the floor, additional armor for pilot seats, armored fuel cells that could survive small arms fire. But adding armor meant adding weight. Adding weight meant reducing payload. A Huey could carry 8 soldiers or 6 soldiers plus armor. Commanders faced impossible choices: protection for the crew or capacity for the mission. Most units chose capacity. The mission came first. Door gunners understood this. They knew the priorities. Getting troops into the fight mattered more than protecting the crew. Extracting wounded mattered more than crew safety. The mission always came first, so they flew without adequate protection. Flew knowing that every flight could end with a bullet through the cabin. Flew anyway. The medical treatment statistics revealed something remarkable about helicopter warfare. The average time from wounding to hospitalization in Vietnam was less than 1 hour. In World War II and Korea, that time was measured in days. Helicopter medical evacuation, medevac, and dust-off missions saved thousands of lives. Soldiers who would have died in previous wars survived because helicopters could reach them quickly. But the helicopter crews paid for those lives. Dust-off operations were 3 times more hazardous than other helicopter missions. The crews flew into hot landing zones without gunship support, often without door gunners, just pilots, medics, and the desperate hope they could get in and out before being destroyed. Major Charles Kelly commanded a dust-off unit. His radio call sign was Dust-Off 65. On July 1, 1964, Kelly received a call for emergency evacuation near Vinh Long. Troops were pinned down in heavy combat with the Viet Cong. Wounded needed immediate evacuation or they would die. Kelly made the decision to fly into an active combat zone. His Huey took fire on approach. He completed the landing. The medics and door gunner loaded wounded while enemy fire continued. Kelly lifted off. An enemy round struck him in the chest, killed him instantly. The helicopter crashed. The crew chief managed to radio for help before the Viet Cong overran the position. Kelly's last words before being hit were, "When I have your wounded." The phrase became the medevac motto. It captured everything about door gunner and helicopter crew philosophy. When I have your wounded, the mission matters more than personal safety. The troops on the ground matter more than the crew in the air. Kelly received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. His story exemplified door gunner courage. They flew into impossible situations knowing they probably would not survive. Flew anyway because soldiers needed them. The technical vulnerabilities of the Huey compounded crew exposure. The UH-1 series had a large exposed main rotor system. The tail rotor was equally vulnerable. A single round through the tail rotor drive shaft meant loss of control. The engine mounted directly above and behind the pilots was exposed to fire from below. Rounds coming up through the cabin floor could strike the engine, the transmission, or the rotor head. Any one of these hits could be catastrophic. The most vulnerable area was called the chin bubble, the plexiglass section beneath the pilot's feet, covering the anti-torque pedals. This section provided visibility, but no protection. Rounds coming up from the ground would pass through the chin bubble and strike the pilots in the legs, groin, or lower torso. Many pilots were killed this way. Door gunners sitting farther back in the cabin had slightly better protection from this angle of fire, but slightly better still meant minimal. The fuel system presented another critical vulnerability. The Huey carried fuel in cells located in the lower center section of the fuselage. Enemy fire striking these cells could cause leaks or worse, ignition. Tracer rounds were particularly dangerous. The incendiary component could ignite fuel vapor, causing an explosion. Multiple helicopters were lost this way. The crew would have no warning, just a sudden fireball in the aircraft tumbling from the sky. Door gunners learned to recognize the signs of critical damage. The engine sound changing, the helicopter vibrating differently, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. When damage occurred, the crew had seconds to decide. Continue the mission or abort. Most continued, completing the insertion, extracting the wounded, finishing what they started. The door gunners kept firing until the helicopter was on the ground, or until they physically could not continue. The enemy learned to exploit helicopter vulnerabilities systematically. They studied American tactics, noted the approach patterns, understood the timing. They learned that helicopters would circle before landing, always from the same direction. They learned that the door gunners fired in predictable arcs. They learned to wait until the helicopters committed to the approach, then open fire at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The most sophisticated tactic involved positioning multiple weapons for crossfire. Heavy machine guns would fire from one direction, forcing the door gunners to concentrate suppression there. RPG teams would fire from a different angle, catching the helicopter during its evasive maneuver. Small arms fire from a third direction would target the crew specifically. This triangulated fire was devastating. Door gunners could not suppress all threats simultaneously. Something always got through. By 1967, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft capabilities had evolved to include dedicated anti-aircraft artillery. Stimulated with 193 cannons, 37 guns, even surface-to-air missiles in some areas. These weapons transformed helicopter operations from merely dangerous to nearly suicidal. The Zu-23 could track a helicopter and fire explosive shells that detonated on proximity. A single hit anywhere on the helicopter could destroy it. Door gunners had no defense. They could not suppress these positions with M60 fire. They could only hope the pilots saw the threat in time to evade. The psychological preparation for door gunner duty was minimal. Soldiers went through aircraft maintenance school if they were crew chiefs. Door gunner school lasted a few weeks. Marksmanship training, aircraft systems, survival procedures, then Vietnam. The training could not replicate the reality, could not prepare them for the sound of rounds punching through aluminum inches from their heads, could not prepare them for watching the soldier across from them take a round in the throat, could not prepare them for the absolute helplessness of being a target with nowhere to hide. Victor Renza arrived in Vietnam as a specialist assigned to the 4th Infantry Division. He qualified as an expert on the M60 during training at Fort Lewis. When he deployed, his company had 8 M60s for 150 men. Renza was assigned as number 1 gun in 2nd Platoon. He trained until he could disassemble and reassemble the M60 blindfolded. By the time he reached Vietnam, the weapon felt like an extension of his body. His training instructors told him the life expectancy of a machine gunner was 7 seconds from the moment the first round was fired. This statistic was designed to emphasize the danger to prepare them psychologically. But it also carried a dark truth. Machine gunners were high-priority targets. The enemy knew the weapon's effectiveness, knew that neutralizing the M60 increased their chances of survival, so they shot at machine gunners first. Door gunners faced the same targeting priority, but with added vulnerability. They could not dig in, could not use terrain, could not shift positions after engaging. They were locked in place by the aircraft, visible from long distances, unable to maneuver. The combination made them the highest priority target on any helicopter. Kill the door gunners and the helicopter became much easier to shoot down. The 1st Cavalry Division, the first fully airmobile division in Army history, conducted more helicopter combat assaults than any other unit. Their operations in the Central Highlands and the Shaw Valley defined air cavalry tactics. They also defined door gunner casualty rates. In some companies, door gunner positions had 100% turnover every 6 months. Every single door gunner was either killed, wounded, or rotated out. Replacements arrived constantly, were trained by veterans who had been in country for maybe 3 months. Then the veterans were hit and the new guys became the veterans. The cycle repeated endlessly. The memorial services became routine. Helicopters shot down, crews killed. Memorial services at base camp. Then back to flying. There was no time to grieve, no time to process. The missions continued. The insertions continued. The casualties continued. Door gunners developed coping mechanisms, dark humor, superstitions, rituals before flights, anything to maintain psychological equilibrium in an environment designed to break them. Some door gunners volunteered for the position. The Army Aviation badge required a certain number of combat flight hours. Door gunner duty provided those hours quickly. Others were assigned because they had the right military occupational specialty. Crew chief training automatically included door gunner duties. Some infantry soldiers volunteered during specific operations because units were short of door gunners. Regardless of how they arrived at the position, the experience was the same. Exposure, vulnerability, constant danger. The relationship between door gunners and the troops they transported was unique in Vietnam. Infantry soldiers respected door gunners in a way they respected few others. The infantrymen saw what door gunners did, saw them leaning out of the helicopter firing while under fire themselves, saw them continuing to fight while wounded, saw them die protecting the insertion. That respect was mutual. Door gunners knew the infantrymen were going into landing zones that might be heavily defended, knew those soldiers would be fighting on the ground while the helicopter flew away to safety. The shared danger created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. The extraction missions were often more dangerous than insertions. When a unit on the ground needed emergency extraction, the situation was usually desperate. Heavy contact with the enemy, casualties that could not walk, low ammunition. The helicopters would fly in, knowing they were entering an active firefight. The door gunners would suppress enemy positions that might be meters from the landing zone. The crew chief would help load wounded while under fire. The pilots would hover with bullets tearing through the aircraft, then lift off, struggling to gain altitude with overloaded weight and possibly damaged systems. Warrant Officer Larry Taylor flew an AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter in Vietnam on June 18, 1968. He was covering an extraction mission near Ap Go Cong. A four-man patrol team was surrounded and nearly out of ammunition. The Huey attempting extraction took heavy fire and had to abort. Taylor saw the situation deteriorating. He made multiple rocket and gun runs, expending all his ammunition, trying to suppress the enemy. When he ran out of ammunition, he did something unprecedented. He landed his Cobra, a two-seat attack helicopter not designed for passengers, in a tiny clearing. The four patrol members climbed onto the rocket pods and skids. Taylor took off with them hanging on and flew them to safety. He received the Medal of Honor for this action in 2023, 55 years after the mission. The story illustrated the lengths helicopter crews would go to save lives. It also illustrated the impossible situations door gunners faced regularly. Taylor could take risks in a Cobra because it was designed for combat, heavily armed with better armor. Door gunners flew in Hueys with minimal protection. They could not make multiple passes, could not orbit the battlefield. They had one chance to land, complete the mission, and escape. During that window, they were completely exposed. The aviation safety investigations conducted after helicopter losses revealed patterns in door gunner casualties. Most were killed by small arms fire to the upper body or head. The ceramic body armor protected the torso, but not the neck, shoulders, or head. Helmets provided protection against shrapnel, but not direct hits from rifle rounds. The M60, mounted at chest height, meant the gunner's upper body was maximally exposed while engaging targets. The investigation reports noted that door gunners often died while still firing. Their bodies would be found with the M60 in position, ammunition belts partially expended, positions indicating they were engaging targets at the moment of death. They died doing their job. This pattern was so common that it became an expected finding in crash investigation reports. Door gunner killed in action while providing fire support. The unit citations told the story in dry military language, but beneath the words were human experiences. Specialist John Smith killed in action while engaging enemy positions during combat assault. Specialist David Johnson wounded in action, continuing to provide suppressive fire until evacuation completed. Warrant Officer Michael Williams remained at his position, despite severe wounds, to ensure extraction of ground forces. The citations accumulated, the names accumulated, the casualties accumulated. By 1968, the entire door gunner program was under review. The casualty rates were unsustainable. Units could not maintain qualified personnel. Training pipelines could not produce replacements fast enough. Aviation commanders proposed solutions. Better armor, better weapons, better tactics. Some improvements were implemented. The M60E1 variant had modifications that made it more reliable. Helicopter designs improved with the introduction of the Cobra gunship, which could provide heavy fire support while keeping crews more protected. The UH-1H model had a more powerful engine, allowing it to carry armor and still maintain payload capacity. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. Combat assaults required helicopters to fly into contested areas, required them to slow down and hover, required door gunners to provide suppressive fire. These requirements created vulnerability that could not be eliminated. Better armor helped, better tactics helped, but nothing could change the basic equation. Door gunners had to expose themselves to do their job. Exposure meant casualties. The statistics validated the concern. Over the entire war, approximately 2,700 non-pilot helicopter crewmen were killed. The helicopter fleet logged over 10 million flight hours. This meant roughly 0.27 deaths per 1,000 flight hours. For comparison, infantry casualties in heavy combat zones averaged 0.4 per 1,000 patrol hours. But infantry soldiers could take cover, use terrain, break contact. Door gunners could do none of these. They were locked into a flying target doing 100 knots at 1,500 FT with nowhere to hide. The veterans who survived carried the experiences for life. John Masaki, the door gunner who arrived in 1968, completed his year-long tour. He flew countless missions, was shot at on most of them, saw aircraft shot down, saw crew members killed. When he returned to civilian life, he had no marketable skills. Being a door gunner did not translate to civilian employment. He considered re-enlisting, becoming a pilot, but decided against returning to Vietnam. The experience had changed him. He carried it for decades. The reunions of helicopter crews decades after the war revealed the lasting impact. Survivors would gather and talk about specific missions, specific landing zones, specific moments when they should have died, but somehow survived. They would honor the ones who did not come home. The door gunners killed in action, the crew chiefs who died at their positions. The pilots shot down attempting impossible rescues. These reunions were not celebrations. They were memorials, acknowledgments of sacrifice that most Americans never understood. The Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association maintains detailed records of all helicopter operations in Vietnam. Their database includes 7,13 Hueys that survived the war out of over 11,000 deployed, 42% destroyed. The database lists 6,975 total deaths in helicopter operations, 2,22 pilots, 2,74 aircrew, 269 passengers. The aircrew category includes door gunners, crew chiefs, and other non-pilot positions. Door gunners were the majority. These numbers exist in military archives and historical databases, but they represent individual humans. 19-year-olds who graduated high school and were drafted. 22-year-olds who volunteered because they wanted to fly. 25-year-olds on their second tour because they felt obligated to serve. Each number was a person with a family, dreams, a future that ended in a landing zone in Vietnam. The door gunner position remained throughout the war despite the casualties. The mission required it. Combat assaults required suppressive fire. Extractions required covering fire. Medical evacuations required protection. No alternative existed that provided the same capability. So young Americans continued to volunteer or be assigned, continued to climb into Hueys, continued to sit and open doors with M60 machine guns, continued to fly into hot landing zones, continued to die doing it. The tactical evolution by 1969 included hunter-killer teams. Light observation helicopters would fly low, draw fire, locate enemy positions. Attack helicopters would orbit high, waiting. When the enemy revealed themselves by shooting at the scout, the attack helicopter would strike. This tactic reduced door gunner casualties on observation helicopters because the scouts flew with minimal crew. But slick drivers, the transport ways, still needed door gunners. The infantry still needed transport. The wounded still needed evacuation. The fundamental mission remained unchanged. The gradual American withdrawal from Vietnam reduced helicopter operations after 1969. Fewer troops meant fewer combat assaults. Vietnamization, the transition of combat operations to South Vietnamese forces, meant American aviation units flew fewer missions. But missions continued until 1973. American door gunners continued to fly and die, protecting operations that were increasingly viewed as pointless by the American public. The last American helicopter to leave Vietnam was a Huey. The iconic image of people climbing a ladder to the roof of the CIA station in Saigon to board an evacuation helicopter was actually an Air America civilian Huey, not a military aircraft. The building was not the embassy but an apartment complex, but the image captured the end. Helicopters, which had defined American operations in Vietnam, carried Americans out at the end. The door gunners who served received relatively little recognition. The Huey itself became iconic. Movies and documentaries featured the distinctive sound of rotor blades. The pilots who flew dangerous missions received medals and recognition. The infantry who fought on the ground were honored as veterans, but Dr. Gunners existed in a strange middle space. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists 58,220 names. Among those names are the 2.74 aircrew members killed in helicopter operations. Their names are carved in black granite alongside infantry soldiers, advisors, pilots, and all the others who died. No designation separates door gunners from other casualties. They are simply names. But each name represents someone who made the choice to serve in what they knew was one of the most dangerous positions in the war. In 2024, 50 years after the war ended, the surviving door gunners are in their 70s and 80s. Many attend veteran reunions. Many participate in memorial services. They tell stories about missions that happened half a century ago with clarity that suggests the memories never faded. They describe landing zones, firefights, helicopter crashes, friends who died. The stories are not bragging. They are testimony. Witness accounts of experiences that younger generations struggle to comprehend. The analysis of why door gunners did not survive Vietnam comes down to simple factors: extreme exposure in the open door, minimal protection from hostile fire, high priority targets for enemy forces, aircraft that operated in predictable patterns at vulnerable speeds and altitudes, missions that required them to fly into the most dangerous situations repeatedly. The cumulative effect of these factors created casualty rates that would be unacceptable in any modern military operation. Modern helicopter operations learned from Vietnam. The UH-60 Black Hawk that replaced the Huey has door guns that fire from cabin windows, not open doors. Crew members have improved armor. Helicopters have defensive systems, including radar warning receivers, missile warning systems, and countermeasures. Tactics emphasize standoff distance and rapid ingress-egress. The lessons were written in the blood of doctor gunners who flew Hueys in Vietnam. But no amount of modern technology changes what those door gunners did. They flew into hot landing zones knowing the odds. They provided suppressive fire that saved countless infantry lives. They protected medical evacuation helicopters that rescued thousands of wounded soldiers. They died at rates that exceeded almost every other military position. They did it for a year-long tour, mission after mission, day after day, until they were killed, wounded, or completed their service. The final assessment is not about statistics or tactics or equipment. It is about human courage. Two gunners understood the danger. Every veteran interviewed described knowing the position was extremely hazardous. But they did it anyway. They did it because soldiers on the ground needed all them. Because wounded men needed evacuation. Because the mission required it. That understanding, that willingness to serve despite knowing the likely outcome, defines their service. The door gunners who did not survive Vietnam left families behind. Mothers and fathers who received telegrams. Wives who became widows, children who grew up without fathers. Brothers and sisters who mourned siblings. The casualties extended beyond the individual killed in action. Every death created ripples that spread through communities, families, generations. The cost was not just 2.74 names on a memorial. It was the cumulative impact on everyone connected to those individuals. The survivors carry guilt. Survivor's guilt is well documented among combat veterans. Why did I survive when others died? What made me special? Do gunners who completed their tours describe watching friends die, watching helicopters crash, watching young men bleed out in the cabin during extraction flights? They survived through what they describe as luck. Being in the right place, the enemy shooting at someone else. Pure chance. That randomness makes the survival harder to process. The memorial services conducted at fire bases in Vietnam followed a pattern. The fallen soldier's boots, rifle, and helmet arranged as a battlefield cross. The unit formation standing in respect. The chaplain reading the 23rd Psalm. The first sergeant calling roll. Each name answered present until reaching the fallen soldier's name. The silence after that name was called. Then the unit dispersing back to their missions. The war continued, the operations continued. The casualties continued. That same pattern repeated at helicopter units. Door gunner killed in action. Memorial service. Replace the door gunner. Continue operations. The individual mattered. The position mattered more. The mission always came first. This prioritization was necessary for military operations, but devastating for, quote, those involved. Men were not people, they were replacements, slots to be filled. Statistics and reports. The human stories behind the statistics reveal a different truth. 19-year-old door gunners who wrote letters home describing the beauty of Vietnam's mountains. 22-year-old crew chiefs who sent photographs of themselves posing with their helicopters. 25-year-old veterans on second tours who knew exactly how dangerous it was but went anyway. These were not statistics. These were Americans who served their country in an extremely hazardous role and paid the ultimate price. The question of why Dr. Gunners did not survive Vietnam has a simple answer. They were placed in an impossible tactical situation, required to operate from open doorways on slow-moving, low-flying aircraft, required to engage enemies who had time to prepare, had concealment, had weapons specifically effective against helicopters, required to do this mission after mission, day after day for a year. The mathematics of probability ensured high casualties, not because Dr. Gunners lacked courage or training or equipment, because the mission itself was inherently unsurvivable at the scale and frequency it was conducted. The legacy of Vietnam door gunners exists in military aviation doctrine. Every helicopter crew training program teaches lessons learned from Vietnam. Every tactics manual includes sections on minimizing exposure during insertions and extractions. Every equipment decision weighs protection versus capability. The door gunners of Vietnam paid the tuition for those lessons. Their sacrifice educated generations of aviators who followed. In the final analysis, the door gunners who served in Vietnam represent a specific kind of courage, not the courage of charging an enemy position or holding a defensive line, but the courage of strapping into a helicopter knowing that your position makes you a target, knowing that the aircraft will fly into dangerous areas repeatedly, knowing that your job is to expose yourself to enemy fire so that others can complete their mission. That courage, sustained over a year-long tour through hundreds of missions, deserves recognition and respect that it has rarely received. The memorial at Fort Rucker, Alabama, the home of Army Aviation, includes a section dedicated to Vietnam helicopter operations. The memorial lists all aviation units that served, all major operations, all significant battles. Among the names are door gunners, crew chiefs, the men who sat in open doors with machine guns. Their names are there alongside pilots and aircraft commanders. Equal recognition for equal sacrifice. But the truest memorial exists in the hearts of those they saved. The infantry soldiers who got into hot landing zones alive because door gunners suppressed enemy fire. The wounded who survived because door gunners protected the medical evacuation helicopters. The reconnaissance teams extracted from impossible situations because door gunners kept firing until the last second. Those veterans remember. They know what door gunners did. They know the price paid. 50 years after the fall of Saigon, the last door gunners of Vietnam are fading. Age and time claim what enemy fire did not. Soon there will be no living witnesses to those experiences. No one who can describe the sound of an M60 firing in a Huey cabin. No one who remembers the exact fear of descending into a hot landing zone. No one who carries the physical and emotional scars of that service. But the record remains. The casualty reports, the unit histories, the personal letters saved by families, the oral histories collected by researchers. These documents preserve the story. They tell of young Americans who served in one of the most dangerous positions in one of America's longest wars. They tell of courage sustained under impossible circumstances. They tell of sacrifice given freely despite knowing the cost. The door gunners of Vietnam did not survive because they were not meant to survive. The tactical situation was designed for effect, not safety. Their mission was suppressive fire at the most vulnerable moment of helicopter flight. Success meant keeping the enemy's heads down long enough for the mission to complete. Their survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. They understood this. They did it anyway. In the end, the story of Vietnam door gunners is not about statistics or casualty rates or tactical analysis. It is about Americans who served when called, who flew dangerous missions because someone had to, who died protecting others in one of war's most exposed positions. Their legacy lives in the soldiers they saved, the missions they completed, and the lessons their sacrifice taught. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as individuals, who gave the PO everything while sitting in an open door with an M60 machine gun firing into the jungle below, knowing that every mission might be their last. That is why door gunners did not survive Vietnam, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because the mission itself was designed to trade their safety for everyone else's survival. They understood that trade. They accepted it. They paid the price, and history owes them recognition for a sacrifice that too few Americans understand or appreciate. For a sacrifice that too few Americans understand or appreciate.